Hi, today I'm going to talk to you about what is oral history. My name is Kimberly Springer, and I curate the oral history collection at Columbia University. By curation, that means that I determine what our collecting priorities are in terms of the kinds of oral histories that we take into the collection. And then I also determine the priorities for preservation. And I'll talk a bit about what preservation means in terms of the analog materials like cassettes and reels that we have. I also teach a course on theories of activism at Barnard University, and I use too many gifts. So today we're going to talk about oral history as a source, and in particular as a primary source, and also where to find oral histories for your research. So first, why oral history? We'll talk about what an oral history is and also where they come from. So as it says here, oral history is a catch-all term applied to two things. It refers to the process of conducting and recording interviews with people in order to elicit information from them about the past. But an oral history is also the product of that interview, the narrative account of past events. So that's an important thing to remember, that oral history is two-pronged. It's the actual process of gathering the oral history, and then also the product that comes out of the oral history. I'm going to play you a clip from this video by Dr. Ifeoma Nwankwo. She talks about what oral history is in the first part in a way that I find very engaging.
I'm Professor Ifeoma Nwankwo, Associate Professor of English at Vanderbilt University. I'm in the English department. I also have an affiliation with the Department of Teaching and Learning here.
Excellent. So if you could define for us, what is an oral history?
What is an oral history? That's a fantastic question. I like to think of an oral history as the story of what had happened, which is very different from the story of what happened.
Okay.
So an oral history is a verbal narration of what had happened, which is richer in many ways than what happened. What happened would normally be the very traditional story that you would read in a book, something that had a narrative format that was organized chronologically, that the once upon a time story. Once upon a time, this happened and Rapunzel let down her hair and the prince climbed up and it was over. What had happened was, well, let me tell you, see, Rapunzel's mother was a trip, and this is what happened, and then Rapunzel started growing her hair because her mom wouldn't let her go get it cut, and I saw Rapunzel one time, and oh my goodness, that was crazy what she was doing. And I tried to fix her up with this other person, but then and she just wanted to go live in that tower. So that is the difference in my eyes between what happened, which is typically written in a book, which is typically in chronological order, which typically meets all the requirements of a traditional story. What had happened is actually more interesting and richer, because it will have all kinds of layers and all kinds of dimensions to the story that you might not get if you require it to be in chronological format, or you require it to only always be in first person, or only always be in the voice of the omniscient narrator. The oral history provides multiple dimensions of a story. Even if it is told by one person, that one person typically includes multiple voices and multiple perspectives.
All right. So you've kind of hinted at this already.
Okay, so I hope that gives you a sense of the kind of detail and richness that can come from oral history, in particular, as opposed to, say, a written account of a story. And just to be clear, this is a pet peeve of mine that I have to throw in. Something that oral history isn't. It isn't simply an unedited interview. And you'll see this a lot in the demand for content for online magazines and newspapers. They'll call something an oral history of. It can be an event, it can be a television show, it can be a fad. But I think the difference between an oral history that goes into the life story of a person who happened to be involved with an event or a fad is that the oral history that's typically found in journalism or in, say, newspapers or online content is simply an unedited interview. And it's very focused. And the journalist usually has a particular point that they want to get to, versus an oral history, which is more of a life history and often starts with the question, where were you born? So I'm going to play just another short clip of StoryCorps, which you might have heard of. There are lots of different storytelling ventures that are quite popular now. And StoryCorps is unique in that they have a set of questions online that people can ask their family members or ask their friends, and then they will edit these down for those emotional, evocative moments that they then play on public radio, usually on Fridays. So here's this video that to give you an idea of just a different form of oral history storytelling.
I just start by asking you one of the questions on my list, right?
Anything you want.
Okay. So what were you like as a kid?
I was pretty weird. I didn't want to do anything but watch TV. And I spent a lot of time by myself. But I always liked talking to older people, like the waitress at the luncheonette near my house or my grandparents. I remember when I was just a few years older than you, your great-grandpa Abe and your great-grandma Rose and her sisters came over to our apartment for Thanksgiving. After dinner, I found this tape recorder lying around, and somehow I got the idea to interview them. I didn't have a clue what I was doing, but I recorded their voices and stories, and I saw how much they loved being listened to. A few years later, your great-grandpa and your great-grandma and all her sisters passed away. But I remembered I'd made that tape, so I went looking for it, but I couldn't find it. Even now, when I go to your grandma's house, I go looking for that tape, just hoping it's going to turn up.
I don't get it. Why do you keep looking for it?
Because it would make me so happy to hear those voices again, and I'd love to play that tape for you. You know, doing that recording really taught me something. You can find the most amazing stories from regular people. All you have to do is ask them about their lives and listen.
Really? That's it?
Yeah, it's simple. We can learn so much about the people all around us, even about the people we already know, just by taking the time to have a conversation. And if you pay just a little attention, you'll find wisdom and poetry in their words.
Do people really want you to ask about their lives?
Yeah, they do. Most people love to be listened to because it tells them how much their lives matter. All you need to ask are questions like, who is the most important person in your life? Or what are you proudest of? Really, listening closely is simple. When you're curious, treat people with respect, and have just a little courage to ask the important questions, great things are going to happen.
So I wanted to share that video as just an example of the different forms that oral history can take in our culture. And what we're going to though focus on are these elements of oral history. So first, oral history is offering people space to tell their story. And it's very important to consider that an interviewer comes into an oral history having done some background research, but what they're not trying to do is dictate the course of the story. Instead, what they're trying to do is evoke details of what the person is already saying, as opposed to having a script that they want them to follow. Oral history is also how they want to tell their story. So the order in which people often tell stories about their lives can get jumbled up. It's not necessarily chronological, and that's okay. It's very interesting then for someone, say a researcher looking at the oral history transcript later or listening to the oral history to think about, well, why did they foreground certain details in their story and how they told it? Oral history is also a series of open-ended questions or topics. And this is as opposed to, say, journalism, where you might be asking somebody yes or no questions to get at the facts of something. Oral history has open-ended questions that might say, tell me about your childhood, as opposed to, can you confirm that this is where you went to school? Oral history is also a willingness to follow where the story organically takes you. And actually that should say where the narrator organically takes you. So the person you're interviewing is the narrator. So where do they want to take you in telling you the story of their lives or even the story about a particular event? And also an oral history is a collection of memories and personal commentaries on a person's life and significant events. We all remember things differently. So you might have three people who witnessed the outcome of the same event, and they might tell you three different stories about how they got there. So oral history is very sort of rich and can be very sort of variable in that way in how people tell these stories and the personal commentary and the personal experience and evidence they bring to those experiences. And lastly, oral history is not about giving voice to the voiceless. This is something that I think occasionally you hear now, you might have heard it in sort of previous iterations of oral history. And I don't like this thing because people have voices already. It's just that sometimes they're not asked questions or they're not asked the right questions or they're not even asked to tell their story. So it's not that they are voiceless, it's just that we actually have to take the time to listen. So today at the Oral History Archives at Columbia, I mentioned before that I curate the collection. And what that means is I'm interested in collecting oral histories. And I'm trying to collect oral histories and hear from people that we haven't heard from before in the collection. So the current pandemic is one of the topics that I'm collecting oral histories about. There's a major project about how the pandemic is impacting people in the New York City area that's being conducted by my colleagues that will have 400 interviews. So that's definitely one area we're interested in. Also mass incarceration, digital culture. I've talked about space and space defined broadly in terms of real estate development, displacement, gentrification, also art, artists, and the art world, and then struggles against bigotry. So for example, Islamophobia or anti-trans violence. So hearing from people who've been impacted by these different areas or they're shaping the space of these different areas. So I want to just talk about three distinct eras of oral history to give you an idea of the development of the field and how that shapes the kind of oral histories that you'll find according to that chronology. So the first era that I talk about is one of using oral history to fill in the gaps of history. The founders of the oral history department, one of them, Alan Nevins, who you'll see here in the pictures, and then also Louis Starr, they were very invested in thinking about how could they use oral history to fill in the gaps around business history. Because at the time, the history of different corporations or innovations wasn't taken particularly seriously. So when the Oral History Research Office was founded in 1948, that was one of its focuses. And they conducted biographical interviews, as it says here, with people they thought who were notable. So people in philanthropy, business, in radio, publishing, filmmaking, the law, architecture, the arts. But a knock-on effect of this idea of notable figures is that most of those figures were white and they were male. So that very much sort of skews the early part of the collection to white men who had positions of power. So there's also a class dimension to that. It's in the 1960s that oral historians begin to recognize oral history as documentary evidence. So not only the life histories of people are important, but the lives as they're lived out and interact with different social movements of the era, mainly. So the New Left movement, the Civil Rights movement, the peace movement, but also community history. So we start to see a lot of different histories of groups of people doing different things. For example, we have an oral history of the Lamont Doherty Observatory at Columbia University. And so we have a collection of oral histories about people doing science and what that experience is like to do science together at that time. And then coming to the current era that we're in, oral history is very much invested in thinking about how do we use oral history to empower people to talk about their lives and the lives of their communities. So oral history that's created for and by communities today. And often these are biographical interviews with people, but they illuminate contemporary social, political, historical events. And I have a picture here of the Obama Presidency Oral History Project because that's one of the major oral histories that we're doing today. And likely there will be an oral history interview with former President Barack Obama, but we'll also be interviewing people who were in his cabinet, who were in government. So there's some of the sort of notable people in the parlance of the early part of the oral history era, but also there are going to be interviews with regular people whose lives were touched by the presidency. So we have an opportunity to combine a lot of different modes of doing oral history today. I wanted to highlight one of the major projects that my colleagues conducted, the September 11, 2001 Oral History Project. They interviewed close to 600 people, and there's over 1,000 hours of oral history testimony. And you can read about the project and some of those oral histories in this book by Mary Marshall Clark, who's one of the leaders in the field of oral history. The book is called After the Fall. And some of the interviews will be available online once we get around to preserving them. They were recorded on mini disc, but we also have the transcripts for a lot of those interviews available in the oral history reading room. A point that I wanted to emphasize about oral histories is that they are jointly authored. So both the narrator and the interviewer are the authors and owners of the oral history. We're of course prioritizing the rights and the experience of the narrator because they're telling their life story, but at the same time, the interviewer is thinking about questions that they want to ask and helping the narrator, if not to determine the direction of the interview, just to formulate their thoughts and make them clearer for people who will be listening to or reading the interview in the future. Okay, so the second part, where can I find oral history? So I'll talk to you a bit about special collections, archives, and then online resources where oral histories live. So here's where I wanted to talk about preservation a bit. Our oral history archive allegedly has 10 to 15,000 oral history interviews. And I have a question mark here because we actually don't have a great way of counting the number of interviews that we have in our offsite facility, but we are engaged in a library-wide digitization project, which means that we're converting a lot of fragile materials, reels, cassettes, mini discs, CDs to digital formats. And that's helping us to get a grasp on how many interviews we actually have. That's why I have a number here that there are 2,000 plus oral history interviews that are in our digital libraries collection. And you'll be able to click on the link in this slide, which will take you to that collection and show you some of the interviews, the audio and transcripts that are in that digital library collection. And then lastly, we have about 3,000 unprocessed interviews. And that is a challenge in terms of thinking about what is it that people want to know about. So basing an assessment on what people are coming to the library to use, and also remote users, what they're requesting and how we prioritize those interviews. So here are 3 places to find oral histories, both in real life on campus and also online. The first is the Oral History Archive. And to be specific, the archive isn't an actual physical space. The Oral History Archive itself is located in the Rare Book and Manuscript Library in Butler Library on the Columbia University campus. So that means that you can create a researcher account. We're open to the public, and you can read our oral history interviews or listen to them if there is audio available in our reading rooms. And we have instructions online for how to do that. There's also the Oral History Portal, or CLIO, and CLIO is Columbia University's card catalog. And you can search oral histories by keyword, by project, also by subject. And we are increasingly adding more detail and links to digitized material online in CLIO for use off campus. And it's useful to think broadly about your topic and all of the keywords that might apply to it, because the collection, again, is 70 years old. So there were different practices in terms of describing the interviews. Sometimes they have proper name indexes, sometimes they don't. Sometimes there are very short biographical descriptions of the people being interviewed. Sometimes they're longer, and we've done a lot to standardize the description in the last, I'd say, like 5 to 7 years. And then lastly, there's the Digital Libraries collection, which I mentioned earlier, and that's the Columbia University Libraries portal for all of the library's archival materials, including oral history. But it's a great resource for being able to not only find transcripts and download them, also you can listen to audio there if there are no restrictions on it. And we have a tool that we call a synchronizer, where if we have audio and transcripts, you're able to listen to the audio, but also to sort of do searches within the transcript to make it easier to facilitate finding what you're looking for in the oral history. Other places to find oral histories, there's the Columbia Center for Oral History Research, which is the research counterpart to the archive, and it's located in the Arts and Sciences Division of Columbia University, and they have a lot of their large-scale projects online. They also have an oral history master's degree program, which is worth looking into if you're thinking about oral history as a career option. And then lastly, there's an oral history research guide, which we have online, which has tips for a lot of what I'm telling you here about using oral history as a primary source, but also links to guides for doing your own oral history. And there are tons of resources online that talk about what you should do before an interview in terms of background information, how you prepare for your interview, also the nuts and bolts of doing an interview in terms of your equipment, recording materials, and also transcription and gaining consent for conducting an oral history interview. And these are just a sample of collections that I think are interesting that you might like to explore in your own time. The Columbia Crisis of 1968 examines the 1968 student uprisings on Columbia's campus. Animal Advocates talks to a lot of the leaders in the animal rights movement in the United States. The Black Journalist collection is quite a rare collection, but it talks to a number of Black journalists from across the United States who were engaged with not only the Black press, but the mainstream, predominantly white press. And then the Physicians and AIDS collection, which is another good one in terms of thinking about an emerging crisis and how the profession responded to it. And I've also listed a book here, The Voice of Witness Reader, which is a book by the organization Witness, which has a number of really sort of interesting interviews that you might want to check out in terms of how to do oral history interviews, because they print the entire transcript in the book. So just to review a few things, we talked about what oral history is in terms of being a process and a product. We also talked about where you can find oral histories, both in person and online. We discussed who creates an oral history, the idea that it's a jointly authored product in terms of both the narrator and the interviewing having a hand in that conversation. And then we also did a little bit of a documentary, like history, meta history of oral history in terms of the uses of oral history as a historical record, as documentary evidence, but also as a tool for empowerment for communities.